Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh. I want to welcome everyone to the first episode of SALDEF's series, Demystifying U.S. History and Activating Sikh Action for Black Justice Movements. For the first session, we are so fortunate to have with us Dr. Nneka D, who will address colonial uprisings and the creation of race from the colonial period to the eve of the Civil War. This session will be moderated by SALDEF Co-Founder Dr. Jaideep Singh, a U.S. historian with a focus on race. My name is Kiran Kaur Gill, and I'm the Executive Director of SALDEF, the Sikh American Legal Defense and Education Fund. SALDEF is the oldest national Sikh American advocacy group in the United States, with a focus on civil rights and religious freedom. Many of you may be wondering why we chose to do this series and why we chose to do this series at this time. The reason is simple. At this time, we are in a historic moment in terms of the activism for social justice in this country. The protests over George Floyd's death and so many others at the hands of the police are the largest and longest running protests in US history. We need to understand the past to provide us the background and context to understand this moment. The second question some of you may be asking yourself is, why should Sikhs care about Black justice movements? How is this issue related to Sikh Americans? There are so many reasons why we should care, but I will give you three. One, without the civil rights movement and the work of Black activists, many of us would not enjoy the rights and opportunities we have in this country today. In fact, many of us owe the fact that we were even able to immigrate into this country to civil rights leaders. Two, we as Sikhs have a duty to stand up for social justice, equity, and dignity for all. It is highlighted throughout Gurbani from the central belief, Ek Onkar. And three, the reality is that many of us have very little understanding of the African American experience and history in this country. In order to be effective allies, we need to do the work of educating ourselves. Before I hand it over to Dr. Jaideep Singh, I would like to start off with a land labor acknowledgement. While we attempt to engage with some of the longstanding history that has brought Sikhs to reside on this land and to seek to understand our place within that history through this series, we must frame our conversation with an acknowledgement in relation to the land we occupy, its stewards, and the communities that sustain this geography. One small ask these communities have is land acknowledgements. Land acknowledgements do not exist in a limited historical context. Colonialism is a current, ongoing process, and we need to build mindfulness of our present participation in it. So we begin by acknowledging that SALDEF, as a Washington, D.C. organization, occupies ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Piscataway and Nkochunk and Acostan people. We recognize, support, and advocate for the sovereignty of these indigenous nations, as well as other nations and historic tribes across this land and beyond. In addition, we recognize that labor from the transatlantic slave trade and Africans and African Americans' work, enslaved and free, were foundational to the building of the United States. We hope that through this series, we are able to illuminate a little bit of this past. And we hope that each attendee feels encouraged to reflect for themselves how their lives are tied to the injustices of both past and present. And with that, I will now introduce Dr. Jaideep Singh.
Thank you, Kiran. It is an honor and a pleasure to be here. I've been involved with SALDEF since its beginning. I'm one of the co-founders. And in that quarter century, police violence, and specifically towards African-American, Latino, and Native American communities, has been something I've been interested in. It began for me with the Rodney King protests in 1991 when I was an undergraduate. So let me begin by explaining why I organized this series and why I think it's so important. To me, it's very simple. We must arm ourselves with an accurate understanding of US history in order to be good allies, and in fact, even to enter into the discussion that is currently going on about race in the US. And we must also do this in order to understand our position as Sikhs, as Sikh Americans, as both racial and religious minorities, because these are both critical factors in our life chances and our life possibilities and in this country. Without this sense of history, we have no idea what we're truly fighting against and how others in the past have mobilized against white supremacy. My hope is the series will provide viewers with a basis to understand the current historical moment in which we reside through a substantive introduction to the history of race and protest against white supremacist violence and legislation and oppression. And of course, we must take a courageous look at the blood-drenched white backlash that has always followed Black resistance and progress. Unless we do that, we really can't understand why Donald Trump exists. And again, this is a long process. This is the first of 6 series, of 6 episodes. And I hope you will stay with us and help and learn and help us allow you to develop this historical consciousness that is so important to make this analysis. Without an historical appreciation of what African Americans have endured and survived, we cannot be good allies. It's really that simple. In fact, we can't be legitimate participations in the discussion regarding race, because if we do not know what happened in the past, not only do we not know the lessons of history, but we can't benefit from the mistakes of those who fought for our freedom in the past. So ultimately, any substantive analysis of our current situation has to begin with an appreciation for what Black folks have done in the past to fight white supremacy and their victories and defeats that have resonated for all communities of color. So the last thing I want to talk about briefly is, again, I want to reiterate what some things Gideon said about why Sikhs should support this struggle and why they have a duty to get involved. The most basic thing is, as Sikhs, we have religious duty to stand up against injustice anywhere we see it. Gurbani is replete with it, as are the gifts that our Guru gave us as reminders that we must lead by example. In Japji Sahib, Guru Nanak says, accept all humans as your equals and let them be your only sect. Similarly, Guru Gobind Singh promoted the principle of universal equality in the verse, Manas ki jaat sabba eke pachanabo, recognize all mankind as a single caste of humanity. Secondly, Sikhs in India have been the victims of the exact same type of state violence, disappearance, and murder that Black people have endured for 400 years in this country. We understand their plight and their oppression of being a minority with few rights that the majority ever respects. Third, the only reason the vast majority of us as Sikh Americans are even in this country is because Black people marched, protested, and demanded reform for decades. And of course, many were murdered. The civil rights movement forced the government to change the racist provisions in U.S. immigration law that barred Sikhs and other Asians from migrating to this country legally from 1907 to 1965. As Sikhs, we are required to be ready to protect the rights of the defenseless and to fight for justice. All you have to do is take a look at the sacrifices that our gurus made for non-Sikhs. Now, this is a tremendous challenge. It requires commitment and investing time. This series is the first step. It's the very first step towards arming ourselves intellectually with a sense of history to understand how we got here so we can be true allies in the national struggle against racial injustice. Finally, I'm so honored and pleased to introduce our speaker. We're very grateful for her joining us. Dr. Nneka D. Dennie is an assistant professor of history at Washington and Lee University. She's a Black feminist scholar with specializations in 19th and 20th century Black women's intellectual thought. Previously, Dr. Dennie had held fellowships in the Africana Studies Department at Davidson College and in the Women's and Gender Studies program at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Amherst, and completed her BA in political science with honors in Africana Studies at Williams College. Dr. Dennie's writings have appeared or are forthcoming in Business Insider, Palimpsest, a journal on women, gender, and the Black International, Atlantic Studies, Global Currents, and the Routledge Companion to Black Women's Cultural Histories, Across the Diaspora from Ancient Times to the Present. Her first monograph, Redefining Radicalism, The Rise of Black Feminism and the Politics of Respectability in the 19th Century, is under contract with the University of Pennsylvania Press. Dr. Dennie is also the co-founder and president of the Black Women's Studies Association. Please welcome Dr. Nneka Dennie.
All right, hello everyone, and thank you, Kiran and Jaideep, for inviting me to join you today. I am really excited to spend some time with SALDEF thinking about the long history of race, racism, and Black protests in the United States. I also think that it is incredibly important for us to be able to build coalitions across race, across gender, nationality, and religion. So I'm really grateful for the opportunity to spend some time with you all to talk about some of the connections in the struggle for social justice between Sikh Americans and African Americans. I'd like for us to begin today with a little thought experiment. I'll read a few names, and if you've heard of that person, please make a mental note to yourself. This is generally the point where I would ask for a show of hands, but since we don't have the pleasure of chatting in person with our coronavirus-induced virtual format, this will have to do for now. Martin Luther King, Ella Baker, Rosa Parks, Claudette Colvin, Michael Brown, Rekia Boyd, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor. The names I just read were of prominent African American men and women who are attached to the civil rights movement or Black Lives Matter movement. Each pair of people were alive during the same time period and are popular for similar reasons. Many people know of Martin Luther King. Far fewer people are familiar with Ella Baker, a civil rights activist who was active behind the scenes and who argued that strong people don't need strong leaders. Rosa Parks, whose refusal to relinquish her seat to a white man resulted in the Montgomery bus boycotts, is a household name. However, she was not the first nor only African American who chose to remain seated. Prior to Rosa Parks' iconic reclamation of Black people's right to exist in public space, Claudette Colvin also chose to remain seated on public transportation in Montgomery. However, because Colvin was a dark-skinned, pregnant 16-year-old, she did not become the face of the Montgomery bus boycotts. The last four people I mentioned hold a place in more recent memory. In 2014, 18-year-old Michael Brown was gunned down by a police officer who claimed he felt threatened when he confronted Brown for stealing cigarettes from a convenience store. Brown's body was left in the middle of the street for hours. The officer was never charged with a crime. 2 years prior, 22-year-old Rekia Boyd was standing outside one night with a group of friends when they were approached by an off-duty police officer. Thinking that the officer was trying to buy drugs from the group, one of Boyd's friends told the officer, and please pardon my language as this is a direct quote, to, quote, "get his crackhead ass out of here," end quote. The officer pulled out his gun and fired into the group, killing Boyd. Although he was charged with involuntary manslaughter, he was found not guilty. Strangely enough, the judge determined that because the officer shot into the group on purpose, the officer was not guilty of involuntary manslaughter. The judge said that first-degree murder would have been the more appropriate charge. But because the officer was never charged with murder in the first place, he walked free. We can now fast forward to 2020. On May 25th, George Floyd was brutally murdered when a police officer kneeled on his neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. Despite the pleas of bystanders, despite being filmed by a 17-year-old girl who is now traumatized from witnessing a murder, despite the presence of other police officers, and despite requests from EMTs to examine Mr. Floyd, he was killed in cold blood and in broad daylight, all because he was suspected of using a counterfeit $20 bill. The 4 officers involved in his death were all fired and were arrested, but they all posted bail. 2 months before Floyd's death, a Black woman EMT named Breonna Taylor was shot and killed by police officers in her Louisville, Kentucky home as she slept. 3 officers in plain clothes were searching for a suspect for a crime and entered Taylor's home without knocking. Her boyfriend, who reasonably thought that there was an intruder in the home, shot at the unidentified officers in self-defense. When officers fired back, they killed Taylor. Had they knocked, they would have known that they were at the wrong house. Had they checked the police department's records, they would have known that the suspect they were searching for was already in custody. They attempted to execute a search warrant, but executed Breonna Taylor instead. One of the 3 officers who killed Taylor was fired at the end of June, 3 months after her death. None have been arrested or charged with a crime. You may have noticed that with the exception of Rosa Parks, you were much more familiar with the men who I acknowledged than the women. Despite being alive in the same time period or being famous for similar reasons, across the board, the women whose stories I shared are generally less well recognized than the men. The reason why people might be unfamiliar with Ella Baker, Claudette Colvin, Rekia Boyd, and Breonna Taylor is because often, when we talk about Black history or racism, what we're really talking about is Black men's history and racism towards Black men. Society frequently equates Black people with Black men in a way that promotes inattention to other categories of difference, like gender, sexuality, and religion, for example. This then excludes large swaths of the Black population. This means that recent Black Lives Matter protests centered George Floyd while neglecting Tony McDade, an unarmed Black transgender man who was killed by police in Tallahassee, Florida, a mere 2 days after Floyd's death. Folks generally understand racism as something that primarily affects Black men, without also considering how it impacts women or Black LGBTQ communities. Kimberly Crenshaw coined the term intersectionality to describe how systems of oppression support each other and at times manifest in varying ways because of how people's identities intersect. Crenshaw suggests that because Black women experience both racism and sexism, the forms of oppression they face may not be identical to that of Black men who experience racism or white women who experience sexism. This intersection of multiple forms of oppression is at the heart of how we must understand Black history and contemporary Black protest. I started us off with this exercise today because it tells us a lot about how we think about Black history. It also tells us a lot about what some of our blind spots may be when we look at African American history, especially regarding what types of Black suffering and Black activism are prioritized, or better yet, whose suffering or activism is prioritized. That being said, one of our main goals for today is to think about how Black history has been told and how we can develop a more expansive and more accurate view of Black history by accounting for all of its variations, especially when it comes to women. I want to emphasize that African American women's history is African American history, and that African American history is indeed American history. As we discuss the history of Black protest and the creation of race today, we'll devote particular attention to where Black women fit in. This leads us to our main question for the day. Given recent social unrest, how did we get here? We know there's a problem, but when did it begin and why hasn't it been solved by now? Next slide, please. By the end of our time together today, and over the next few weeks with the other episodes in this series, you'll have the answer to that question. For now, I'll offer a historical overview of the origins of racism, slavery, and Black protests in the U.S. We'll spend our time thinking about a few specific questions that will allow us to think about the continuing legacies of anti-Black racism in the contemporary moment. The questions are as follows. How did slavery and colonialism create racial others? What did slavery entail beyond forced labor? How did Black women give meaning to American democracy in the wake of the American Revolution? And finally, what does it mean to be a citizen in a country where there's a constant threat of violence? As we transition from one question to the next, I'll pause for a couple minutes to take a few questions from you all as participants before we move on. I'll also pose some questions to you throughout that I encourage you to respond to in the chat bar. I'm really aiming for us to have a bit more of a conversation than a lecture to the extent that it's possible using Zoom, rather than being able to chat with each other in person. Next slide, please. I want to start by discussing how colonialism led to the creation of the racial other, which was vital to creating systems of slavery. In so doing, I'll highlight the role that scientific racism played in othering Black people and why it became financially profitable for white settlers to exploit the Black racial other. In 1492, Christopher Columbus set out for India, and he got lost. The result was that he arrived in the Caribbean and traveled to North and South America shortly thereafter. I want to be clear before we continue. Columbus didn't discover anything because in order for it to be a discovery, you need to be the first one there. And as Kiran so aptly mentioned when we were beginning, Indigenous peoples have always been in the United States, or what we now know as the United States, in North America and in South America. Indigenous peoples had already lived in the New World by the time that Columbus arrived. It was this first contact that laid the foundation for European conceptions of racial others and racial inferiority. Prior to turning to slave labor, colonizers experimented with different types of forced labor with Native Americans. They first established the encomienda system. In the encomienda, settlers from Spain were supposed to convert Native Americans to Christianity, teach them Spanish, and protect them in exchange for labor. Yet, this was hard labor where Native Americans, were subject to extreme punishments or death for resisting. A different system of labor, called the repartimiento, began to replace the encomienda in 1549. This new version of forced labor was supposed to be more benevolent and less harsh than the original one. With the repartimiento, indigenous communities were required to provide a certain percentage of people to do different forms of unpaid labor for a few weeks or months out of the year. Neither of these experiments in Native American labor were identical to slavery, but indigenous peoples were still forced to do labor on behalf of colonizers. The Queen of Spain, Queen Isabella, eventually forbid the enslavement of Native Americans because the Spanish deemed them to be civilized. The same could not be said of Africans. Colonizers were unsuccessful in extracting the desired amount of forced labor from Native Americans, in part because they committed genocide of indigenous peoples, and in part because Native Americans became infected with unfamiliar diseases like smallpox and the measles. European settlers then turned to Africa, where they believed they had found an unlimited labor force. This marked the beginning of the transatlantic slave trade. Slavery had already existed in ancient civilizations, and in fact, slavery existed in Africa as well. The buying and selling of other human beings as property is a heinous act in and of itself in any period of human history. What makes the transatlantic slave trade distinct, however, is that it produced something that historians call racial slavery. It was not slavery as a result of being captured in a war, or slavery where someone was temporarily enslaved to pay a debt, or slavery where enslaved people still had social mobility and could rise through the ranks of the government or military. Instead, it was permanent bondage based on who someone was and based on the idea that some human beings were inherently inferior to others and perhaps not human at all. The emergence of the African slave trade transformed the exchange of people for money into the most brutal, violent, and dehumanizing process possible. At this point in time, someone might ask, how did this happen? What made slavery possible? And this is a question with two answers. The first is greed. Colonizers sought to make as much profit as possible with as little work as possible. As a result, they exploited Africans. Slavery provided the basis for European capitalism as slaveholding property owners accumulated wealth from enslaved labor. Capitalism, as an economic system, is one that concentrates wealth at the top while exploiting and underpaying workers. Think about companies like Walmart and Amazon, for example. The owners of the companies are billionaires, while the lowest paid workers make less than $15 an hour. Slavery took capitalism a couple steps further. Slaveholders accumulated wealth while exercising absolute authority over every facet of enslaved laborers' lives and inflicting horrendous abuses against enslaved people, all with the backing of the law. The second answer to the question of what made slavery possible is that racism emerged as a justification for slavery. Slavery came first and racism followed. The only way to validate something as brutal as the slave trade was to determine that Africans were inferior, that they deserved it, that Black people were not human. This is where we see the creation of the racial other taking place. After the slave trade began, Europeans determined that racial and cultural differences between them and Africans justified their enslavement. Scientists, anthropologists, and philosophers constructed definitions of race that solidified by the 19th century. They attempted to offer scholarly evidence of Black inferiority by studying the trajectory of human evolution. By the 1700s, many intellectuals intensely debated the origins of humankind. Some scholars argued that humans shared a single origin. They suggested that the biblical Adam and Eve were the first white humans, and that inferior non-white people eventually emerged because of things like climate and life conditions. Other people determined that different races in fact belonged to entirely different species. Despite their different conclusions about whether humans had a single origin or multiple origins, European thinkers were interested in identifying these origins so that they could explain the root cause of innate racial differences. Next slide, please. In 1742, for example, David Hume, an English philosopher, declared, "I am apt to suspect the Negroes to be naturally inferior to the whites. There scarcely ever was a civilized nation of that complexion, nor even any individual eminent either in action or speculation. No ingenious manufactures amongst them, no arts, no sciences. On the other hand, the most rude and barbarous of the whites, such as the ancient Germans, the present Tartars, have still something eminent about them in their valor, form of government, or some other particular. Not to mention our colonies. There are Negro slaves dispersed all over Europe, of whom none ever discovered any symptoms of ingenuity. Though low people without education will start up amongst us and distinguish themselves in every profession. In Jamaica, indeed, they talk of one Negro as a man of parts and learning, but it is likely he is admired for slender accomplishments, like a parrot who speaks a few words plainly." Philosophers like Hume were not alone. They were joined as well by scientists who similarly sought to explain the source of racial difference. One such scientist who you may have heard of before is Carl Linnaeus. He's the scientist who introduced binomial nomenclature as a way to classify plants and animals. We call ourselves Homo sapiens because Linnaeus said so in 1758. What many people don't know, however, is that Linnaeus went further than simply calling humans Homo sapiens. He determined that although humans belong to the same species, races can be classified into distinct categories with natural behavioral characteristics. Linnaeus differentiated between Homo europaeus, Homo asiaticus, Homo americanus, and Homo africanus. In his estimation, each race could be classified by its physical features, its behavior, and how it governed itself. He made the following judgments about Europeans, Asians, Indigenous Americans, and Africans. The Homo europaeus was, quote, gentle, acute, inventive, and governed by laws, end quote. The Homo asiaticus was, quote, severe, haughty, avaricious, and ruled by opinions, end quote. The Homo americanus was, quote, obstinate, merry, free, and regulated by customs, end quote. Linnaeus reserved his starkest description for Homo africanus. He stated, quote, women without shame, they lactate profusely, crafty, indolent, negligent, anoints himself with grease, governed by caprice. According to Linnaeus, while different races belonged to the same species, they nevertheless inherited different traits, some of which were undesirable. Charles Darwin made similar arguments over 100 years later in 1871. Although slavery had already been abolished in the United States by this point in time, this example from Darwin can tell us a little bit about how Americans were thinking about race during the 1800s, especially considering that the passage I'm about to read was something that he wrote down only 6 years after the abolition of slavery. Darwin thought that humans belonged to a single species. Nevertheless, he asserted, quote, there is, however, no doubt that the races, when carefully compared and measured, differ much from each other, as in the texture of the hair, the relative proportions of all parts of the body, the capacity of the lungs, the form and capacity of the skull, and even in the convolutions of the brain. Their mental characteristics are likewise very distinct, chiefly as it would appear in their emotional, but partly in their intellectual faculties. Keeping these philosophical and scientific descriptions in mind, we can make sense of how European colonizers created the racial other. The myth of non-white people savagery had informed European colonialism and American expansion since at least the 1500s. over the next 300 years, scientists and philosophers, people who were generally thought to be smart people at the time, developed detailed analyses of Black inferiority, which were ultimately used to justify slavery. The flip side of this is that ideas about Black inferiority relied on notions of white superiority. Similarly, and as I'll explain before we wrap up today, racist and sexist ideas about Black women relied on notions of white women's purity and innocence. They were two sides of the same coin. Before we move on to our next question, I'd like to take a few minutes to see if there are any questions or comments. Feel free to type yours in the Q&A bar if you haven't done so already. I see a question here asking about if race was a political invention for the suppression of Indigenous peoples. I would say absolutely. I think that we see the concept of race taking shape concurrently with the expansion of European colonialism. And this is for a reason. This is not simply because it is coincidental, but rather that the idea of race serves a particular function and it accomplished a particular purpose. And what we see taking place is that during the 1500s, the notion of race was used to justify European expansion in ways that allowed them to really make sense of, or say, oh, it's okay if we're like doing these awful things because these people are different from us. That's really the role that we see race taking place, or the role that we see race fulfilling during the 1500s. And so something that we can also continue to think about is, what role does race serve today? What purpose does it exist for? I think that that's a question that we can continue to think about. That's not necessarily something I have an answer to at the moment, but if race emerged in order to play a role during the 1500s, what role does it still play and for whom? Those are the questions that I would then pose. I'm also seeing a question, given the fact that the human genome has been sequenced, what race is Kamala Harris? I have a multi-part answer to this question. I would like to begin by reminding folks that race is a social construct, not a biological fact. What I mean by this is that we take cues from how people look, from how they speak, from a whole manner of things, from what country we think they are from, in order to determine what race someone is, right? So skin color alone, for example, is not race. I'm Black, but there are also people who are not Black who are darker than me, who you might find in different parts of the world, for example, Southeast Asia. There are also people who might determine someone's race based on the shape of their nose or their hair, none of which you can tell from looking at a human genome. So I really want to discourage against thinking about race in biological terms, primarily because it is not something that is biologically proven, and also because this notion of biological race is one that has been used, especially during, I would say, the 19th and 20th centuries, to promote some really dangerous ideas about inferiority in some of the ways that I've mentioned here when we're speaking about scientific racism. That being said, with race being a social construct, race is something that is partially because of who you think you are, but also race is something that other people tell you are, right? Like, so if I walk into a room right now, I can't say I'm a Caucasian woman. That wouldn't fly with a lot of people. They would look at my hair, they would look at my nose, and they would say, no, that's not true, right? So someone doesn't just choose what race they are. That being said, when we're thinking about Kamala Harris, of course she's Black, and of course she's Indian. I don't think that these are two things that are mutually exclusive in any way. And so as we're thinking about race, it's important to recognize how race is very fluid. The last question that I will address is about the changing definitions of race, simply because I mentioned the fluidity just now. Race has changed a lot in a legal sense because we can take a look at the census, for example, from any point in history. And at some years, you might see a lot of different variations to determine what race someone is. And in some instances, we see those terms changing throughout time. So it changes with the wind, basically. It changes with the wind. I would say that it also changes based on location. I had a professor when I was an undergraduate student who is an African American woman, but she was doing research in Cuba. And so she arrived in Cuba, she was filling out her identification documents. And when it got to race, she wrote down negra, which would be Black. But they told her, no, you are mulata, you are morena. They told her she was another race than what she has been her entire life, in part because she had a somewhat light complexion, but also because of her profession. As a professor, that offered her a little bit of a higher class standing than some other folks may have had. And they took that into account when determining her race. So that the point is that our definitions of race are very flexible based on space, based on time, based on location. It's really up in the air a lot of times. I see that there are a couple other questions, and I'm going to hope to get to those towards the end so that we can keep on moving through some of the other sections that we have here. Can we go to the next slide, please? I'd now like to elaborate on some key features of slavery. In particular, we'll think about what slavery entailed beyond forced labor. From the 16th to 19th centuries, over 12 million Africans were shipped to the New World. Of those who survived the Middle Passage, fewer than 500,000 arrived in the United States. The vast majority were dispersed throughout the Caribbean and South America. We can think about these people as being part of the African diaspora. The term African diaspora refers first and foremost to movement away from the African continent, whether it was through forced migration like slavery or voluntary migration, like people immigrating of their own free will. Secondly, we can think about the African diaspora as something that has resulted in moments of closeness and distance in the cultural practices and experiences of Black people worldwide. The experiences of enslaved people are as diverse as the African diaspora itself. Given the broad geographical scope of Africans' arrivals in the New World, I'll start with a little bit of background about where enslaved Africans were transported. Next slide, please. And can you also click play on the video? Okay, perfect, thank you. And so that's gonna go on its own. What we're looking at right now is a video created by Slate that has an animation of the Atlantic slave trade that runs for 2 minutes. What you're seeing in front of you is a map of all of the documented slave ship voyages that took place over the course of about 300 years. You see that there are little dots going from Africa to other areas. The bigger the dot, that means that there were more people on the ship. So as you watch, think about if there's anything in particular that you notice. I encourage you to share your reactions or observations in the chat bar. All right, I want to call your attention to a drastic dip we're about to see right about here. So we see that it slowed down at the point that I mentioned. And one important point is that when we see the slave trade slowing down with that drastic decline on the map, that the change that we see reflects the fact that the international slave trade was banned in the US in 1808. And this wasn't because people suddenly became charitable or had a change of heart. This is because the domestic slave trade was so profitable that American slave traders didn't need to rely on an international market and didn't want competition from the international market. The other big takeaway that I see a lot of you mention as well is that a really small portion of slave ships arrived in the US while far more arrived in Brazil and in the Caribbean. So we see that slavery and indeed Black people existed all throughout the New World. You all are correct with some of your observations that we saw a lot of traffic towards South America, and then we saw a bit more going in the direction of North America. But I'd just like to clarify that what we see, it is heading in the general direction of North America, but that was actually far more people arriving in the Caribbean. And so we were able to take a look at this map, and we're able to see just how vast the slave trade was, and we're able to see exactly how frequently some of these voyages were taking place. All right, wonderful. So to get us a little bit back on track, as I discuss the Atlantic world today, I'm referring to the countries whose people were active in exchanging ideas, producing and trading goods, and migrating across the Atlantic Ocean. Broadly speaking, I'm talking about the social and political sphere shared by Europeans, Africans, and newly arrived Americans from the 1500s to 1800s. People frequently treat slavery as a uniquely American phenomenon, when that's not actually the case. Slavery and its long-lasting effects were present and remain present all throughout Latin America, the Caribbean, and the United States. Keeping in mind our introductory exercise, today we'll examine Atlantic slavery in relation to women specifically. We'll also take into consideration some of the recurring themes that we see across the regions that shared the experience of slavery. Next slide, please. Thank you. The first commonality we see between slavery and Latin America, the Caribbean, and the United States is how slavery was enforced. Every region had what we refer to as slave codes. Slavery and white supremacy became the basis of colonial life as complex systems emerged to solidify slavery in the New World. On the Caribbean island of Barbados, for instance, the Slave Code of 1661 instituted brutal punishments like being burned in the face for enslaved people who were found guilty of crimes. Meanwhile, whites enjoyed legal protection for inflicting violence on the enslaved. In 1662, a Virginia law established that children born to Black women would inherit their mother's status as free or enslaved. As such, Black women's reproductive labor became a market commodity. In 1685, the French government implemented the Code Noir, a detailed set of regulations that applied to all French American colonies. One restriction, presumably intended to quell slave rebellions, prohibited enslaved persons belonging to different slaveholders from gathering together at any time of day. Violators would be whipped, branded, or killed. Throughout the Americas, slave codes regulated the system of slavery and were ingrained into the laws of each colony or country. The next similarity we see across all regions is the importance of reproduction. Enslaved women's ability to have children was critical to sustaining slavery throughout the New World. Out of all the locations we examined, the United States was the only one where the slave population reproduced itself and actually increased after the international slave trade was abolished. Although slavery continued in the United States until 1865, as I mentioned when we were looking at the map, 1808 is the year that it became illegal to continue to import Africans into the country. This means that it was only possible for the number of enslaved people in this country to increase, which it did, if Black women were having children. The US is unique in that regard. The slave population did not reproduce itself in Latin America and the Caribbean. Rather, importing Africans through the international slave trade was the main way that the slave population increased in these regions. Because Black women's reproduction was required to sustain slavery, reproduction became one form of labor that they were expected to perform. Enslaved Black women's labor varied depending on the region where they lived, but their reproductive labor remained constant. Women in urban areas frequently did domestic work, like being washerwomen or cooks, while women in rural areas did more agricultural labor, like working on plantations or harvesting crops. Sugar was the main good being produced in the Caribbean, while countries in Latin America primarily exported coffee. Throughout the US, different crops were more prominent in different areas. States in the Upper South, like Virginia, produced a lot of tobacco. In swampy areas, like in the South Carolina Lowcountry or in Louisiana, enslaved people cultivated rice. Most areas throughout the South relied primarily on cotton. Across all of these states, though, and across different continents, there was a premium placed on enslaved Black women's fertility. Some women were purchased specifically because of their potential to have children. It was common for slave ads to appear in newspapers describing enslaved people's physical characteristics, like their height and build, when they were to be sold. Ads would also mention what types of work they have performed previously or could do in the future. For men, these ads placed a heavy emphasis on their age, skill, or physique. One ad for a slave auction in Kentucky in 1855 is pictured here. It reads, 3 bucks, aged from 20 to 26, strong, able-bodied. 1 wench, Sally, aged 42, excellent cook. 1 wench, Liz, aged 23, with 6-month-old pickaninny. 1 buck, aged 52, good kennel man. 17 bucks, aged from 12 to 20, excellent. For women, these ads frequently made note of their fertility or appearance. One such ad from Rhode Island reads, to be sold, a Negro wench capable of doing most kinds of household work. She is strong and healthy, and among other qualifications, is a most notable breeder, which makes it requisite for the present owner to sell her. Right? So as they're calling her a notable breeder, they're emphasizing that this is someone who will likely be able to have more children in the future, and someone who will likely be able to make you more money in the future because you could put those children to work or sell those children. Another slave ad states, to be sold, a likely Negro wench, a very good cook, suitable for any family, can be well recommended for her honesty, and is well clothed. She is sold for want of employment. The word likely here, where it refers to her as a likely Negro wench, means that she is attractive, and by highlighting her looks, the ad suggests that she would be a good person to become a breeder or perhaps a concubine. Slaveholders profited from enslaved women having children. Women's fertility was highly valued because it meant that slaveholders could own more slaves without having to purchase them. As one slaveholder in Barbados stated, quote, it was cheaper to breed than to buy Negroes, end quote. Pregnancy did not protect Black women from performing hard labor, and they were generally expected to continue to carry out the same tasks as other enslaved people. Enslaved mothers were frequently sold away from their children, and if they did in fact live together, there were few avenues to protect their children from the brutalities of slavery. Black women's fertility not only meant that they were forced to have children, but that they were frequently at risk of sexual violence, which was another recurring theme regarding women in slavery in the Black Atlantic. At this point, I'd like to issue a trigger warning. I should also just issue a trigger warning for all of African American history because all of it is violent and triggering. But at this point specifically, I'm about to discuss sexual violence and rape. And so this is just a little bit of a heads up in case this is something that you would prefer to step away from for a few moments. It is impossible to talk about the brutality of slavery without also recognizing that Black women were subject to specific gendered forms of punishment and terror. This is not to say that Black men were not also sexually abused, because this did occur as well. Rather, it is to establish that rape was an ever-present concern for enslaved women and girls. Because of racist and sexist ideas about Black women's barbarity and Black women's hypersexuality, they were presumed to always be available for sex. In the eyes of the law, Black women were unrapeable. It was not a crime to rape a Black woman. Some women had no other choice but to be a concubine for the man who enslaved them. I say concubine and not mistress because mistress implies some level of choice, consent, or willingness to have sexual relations with slaveholding men. In the context of slavery, it was impossible for Black women to give or withhold consent for sex. In some instances, being a concubine resulted in small material improvements for women and their children, like food, clothes, or not having to perform the most strenuous labor, although they were still being forced to perform labor. I'm hesitant to call these things benefits, though, because there is no such thing as a benefit to being enslaved. That being said, slaveholders would frequently father children with enslaved women, children who would then be enslaved as well. In the United States, Latin America, and most of the Caribbean, children would follow the condition of the mother. If a Black woman was free, her child would be born free. If she was enslaved, the child would be born enslaved. This held true regardless of who the father was and whether he was enslaved, a free Black man, or a slaveholding white man. When slaveholders raped enslaved women and produced a child, the child was not guaranteed their freedom. Some enslavers sold their own children to others. Some freed their children after their deaths. Some continued to enslave their children, but may not have subjected the child to the harshest forms of labor. The vast majority of slaveholders, though, did not claim the child as their own, because to them, that child was nothing more than a slave whose labor they could profit from. There are many harrowing accounts of slaveholders inflicting sexual terror on enslaved women, accounts that I will not rehash here. I do recommend, however, reading Harriet Jacobs' slave narrative, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. Next slide, please. In this autobiography, Jacobs explains that from the time she was 14 or 15 years old, she lived in constant fear of the man who owned her because he continually made unwanted sexual advances towards her. Not only did she live in fear of him, but she also lived in fear of his wife, who had a temper and was jealous of the unwanted attention that Jacobs got from her husband. This leads me to the final recurring theme that we see between slavery in the United States, Latin America, and the Caribbean: white women's active participation in the slave trade. A common misconception is that white women were innocent bystanders to slavery, and that white men were the only ones who played a role in perpetuating violence against Black people. This is false everywhere. White women did not simply benefit from slave labor from a distance, but were highly involved in the daily administration of slaveholding households, owned enslaved people as property, and inflicted punishments on enslaved people. Yet, the myth of white women's innocence is central to the othering of Black women in particular. The belief in enslaved Black women's savagery is predicated on a belief in white women being the exact opposite: pure, delicate, and gentle, for example. Therefore, in order to upend racist and sexist beliefs about Black women's inferiority, we must also do away with a belief in white women's superiority, particularly as it pertains to their roles in perpetuating slavery. In Peru in 1794, for example, an enslaved woman filed a lawsuit for her freedom. The white woman who enslaved her argued that the woman should not be freed because she loved her like a daughter. In Barbados, a high percentage of the slaveholding population was single white women, some of whom rented out enslaved women as prostitutes in order to make a living for themselves. In the United States, during the Civil War, many slaveholding men left home to fight for the Confederacy. As a result, their wives were left to oversee and manage their plantations, including the enslaved people who worked there. White women were not exempt from the brutality of slavery. They are more than complicit. They were active and eager participants. A book that was published last year and has recently won several awards is titled They Were Her Property: White Women as Slave Owners in the American South. I highly recommend that you take a look at it if this is a topic you're interested in. I also recommend reading Deborah Gray White's book, Aren't I a Woman? Female Slaves in the Plantation South, because that's really one of the first major texts that laid the groundwork for how we're able to understand African-American women's experiences of slavery. I know that was a lot of information, so before we move on, we're gonna pause for questions again. And so we'll take a moment to look at the Q&A bar again. Jaideep and Kiran, if there are any particular questions that you think we should focus on, please feel free to bring those to my attention as well. And so at this point, we'll just stop and take a moment to look at some of the questions in the chat and in the Q&A. Okay, I see a question here. At the time Africans were enslaved, were there enough educated class in African Americans or even in Africa to oppose slavery when it was beginning to rise initially? So I want to reiterate one of the points that I had mentioned previously, which is about the different forms of slavery that took place, right? So slavery was not brand new in the United States. Slavery was not brand new with Europeans, right? But it was a different type of slavery. So the ancient Greeks and Romans, everyone used to enslave people, which is not to say that it was okay, but simply to say that it is a fact. And Africans were not exempt from that, right? So Africans also enslaved people, but it was a different type of slavery. So a couple examples are that slavery in Africa, it resulted from perhaps being a prisoner of war, not from someone who lives right next door to you or something like that, right? But there is a neighboring tribe or territory who may have been at war with another one. Someone ends up getting kidnapped in a war and are then held as a prisoner, and they end up being sold as a slave, right? So that's one facet of slavery in Africa. One of the other things that we can take into consideration is that slavery in Africa was not permanent and was not passed down from parent to child in the same way that it was in the United States. So that being said, the question of whether there were enough educated people in the US or in Africa to oppose slavery when it was beginning, I think that question is one that doesn't sufficiently account for the existence of slavery in Africa at the same time that the transatlantic slave trade was beginning. I would also say that one of the main ways that enslaved people were acquired in Africa was also through threats of violence and brutality. So part of it may have been through financial incentives, sure, but part of it also relied on intimidation from European slave traders who were making demands to be provided with a supply of labor, right? So at that point, it's not a question of education, and it's not a question of opposing slavery, because it was a different type of slavery. And two, even if they wanted to oppose that type of slavery, it seemed different from their own. And even if they wanted to oppose it, there was still a sort of coercion that was taking place. So that's how I would respond to that question. And I would also suggest that no amount of education among African Americans who were already in the US would have been able to prevent the slave trade. So Black people have always been abolitionists in this country, whether they were educated or not. But at the same time, African Americans were outnumbered at that point in time. And even if there were a lot of African Americans who were opposing slavery, This was a really large scale system. And so it's not something that education or opposition would have been able to stop in its tracks if it's coming from Black people alone or from African Americans alone. This is a really good question that I see here about what role religion played to enslave people. I would say that this is twofold. So Christianity was very popular among enslaved people and also among slaveholders. So on one hand, we see that some slaveholders sought to use Christianity to justify slavery. In that they would argue that Africans and African Americans were cursed as the biblical descendants of Ham, and therefore slavery was their punishment. They would also contend that the Bible says that you should listen to your master, right? So it was very common for slaveholders to hold mass with their enslaved populations, but be really choosy about which parts of the Bible they're actually using and which biblical teachings they are trying to impart to people, and presenting Christianity in a really biased, perverted way in order to justify slavery. The flip side of that, though, is that there were African Americans and enslaved people who did not accept the premise that they were accursed people, but rather that they were a chosen people. Who were similar to, and they likened themselves to Moses leading them to the promised land, and Moses leading the Israelites out of Egypt. And so religion also offered inspiration to enslaved African Americans. Religion provided them with faith and with hope, and with aspirations of freedom. So we see religion functioning in a couple of different ways during slavery. I see one final question I want to take on this matter before we move on to our next question. How might the transatlantic slave trade of Africans to the Caribbean relate to the slave trade of South Asians who were brought to the Caribbean by the British Empire during colonial times? Many were Sikhs as well. Great question. Give me just a sec to have some water and we will dive into that one. Okay, I really appreciate this question because you pull out some important commonalities, and that is about colonialism and the scope of the British Empire. So I would say that slavery was one manifestation of colonialism, but not the only manifestation of colonialism, right? That being said, there is a shared experience of imperialism between racialized peoples all over the world. I think the British Empire has colonized something like 90% of the landmass of the globe over its lifetime. Please do not quote me on the exact percentage, but the British Empire was really expansive. And that being said, the enslavement of Africans in the Caribbean was not the only type of forced labor that the British Empire relied on. We also see, if we look at countries like Trinidad and Jamaica, for example, that indentured labor, because of colonialism and because of the British Empire, resulted in high Indian populations in Trinidad and high Chinese populations in Jamaica. So I think that this is a really important question because this is a shared experience of forced labor. This is a shared experience of forced migration. This is a shared experience of imperialism that links together Africans and African descended people and South Asians and South Asian descended people. Because as colonial subjects, Africans and South Asians have absolutely had similar experiences. So I really appreciate you asking that question. I think that it's really important for us to be able to tease out those linkages, because the systems of racism do not only affect Black people. Systems of oppression do not only affect Black people. these are experienced by all people to varying degrees, or rather all racialized people to varying degrees. So thank you for that. All right, next slide, please. All right, so now that we understand the specific ways that slavery impacted Black women, I want us to take a look at the flip side, which is, what did Black women do with and for their freedom? Or more specifically, how did Black women give meaning to American democracy in the wake of the American Revolution? Can we go to the next slide, please? Especially considering that Americans fought a war for their freedom during the 1700s and were denying freedom to millions of African Americans at the same time, it's important for us to stop and think about how we might be able to reconcile or not reconcile these two competing ideals. There were many contradictions between the existence of slavery on one hand and the founding of a free republic on the other. During the American Revolution, drawing on Enlightenment era philosophers like John Locke, some Americans saw the right to own property as a necessary component of freedom. If property rights were central to liberty, however, so too was slavery, since it was a major form of property ownership during the 18th century. This means that freedom for some was predicated on the enslavement of others. This paradox had particular implications for Black women, who, as we've established, were essential to sustaining slavery in the United States through their reproductive abilities. There was perhaps no population more acutely acquainted with the contradictions of our country's founding ideals than enslaved Black women. Despite their exclusion from the American body politic, Black women consistently found ways to leave their mark. The next question I'd like for us to explore together today is, how did Black women give meaning to American democracy in the wake of the American Revolution? Through two brief case studies, I'll show how Black women simultaneously exposed fractures in the country's democratic system and worked to mend them. Next slide, please. We'll first consider the case of Mum Bet. Mum Bet was an enslaved woman who was born in New York around 1744, and in her youth, she was given to her former owner's daughter and new husband, Colonel John Ashley of Massachusetts. While many people generally associate slavery with the South, it's important to note that slavery existed in all 13 colonies. It ended slightly earlier in some northern colonies and states, in part because of freedom suits like the one brought by Mum Bet. Freedom suits are exactly what they sound like. Some enslaved people secured their freedom by suing their masters for it. Historical accounts indicate that Mum Bet, who eventually renamed herself Elizabeth Freeman, overheard John Ashley discussing the recently ratified Massachusetts state constitution with an attorney, Thomas Sedgwick. The portion of the Constitution in question stated, "Mankind in a state of nature are equal, free, and independent of each other, and have a right to the undisturbed enjoyment of their lives, their liberty, and property." Again, we see how this idea of property ownership factors into colonial ideas about what people should naturally have a right to in a democracy. Mum Bet understood the state constitution to be incompatible with slavery, allegedly stating, "I heard that paper read yesterday that says all men are created equal and that every man has a right to freedom. I'm not a dumb critter. Won't the law give me my freedom?" Despite her enslavement and her inability to read or write, she understood, I lost my place a little bit. Despite her inability to read or write, she understood that there were very clear contradictions between being enslaved and the United States fighting a war for their own freedom. What happened with Mum Bet is that she and another enslaved man, Brom, worked with Sedgwick to sue for their freedom. A jury decided the case in their favor. This case offered a legal precedent for a similar suit 2 years later, Commonwealth versus Denison. The decision in this case effectively deemed slavery unconstitutional. As Chief Justice William Cushing wrote, "All men are born free and equal. Every subject is entitled to liberty and to have it guarded by the laws as well as life and property, and in short, is totally repugnant to the idea of being born slaves." This being the case, I think the idea of slavery is inconsistent with our own conduct and constitution, and there can be no such thing as perpetual servitude of a rational creature. The case of Mumbet shows that regardless of their social position, class status, or education, Black women have always been acutely aware of the theoretical limitations and possibilities of American democracy. Next slide, please. We turn now to Maria Stewart, who was born free in Hartford, Connecticut in 1803. After being orphaned at a young age, Stewart worked as a domestic servant. In Boston in 1831, she became the first African-American woman public speaker and the first woman to lecture before an interracial and co-ed audience. The spirit of the American Revolution lived on in her work, and she frequently used it to advocate for the abolition of slavery. Maria Stewart's abolitionist speeches and writings often centered the plight of enslaved Black women. For example, in her 1831 pamphlet, Religion and the Pure Principles of Morality, the Sure Foundation on Which We Must Build, she asked, "How long shall the fair daughters of Africa be compelled to bury their minds and talents beneath a load of iron pots and kettles?" During the 19th century, African-American women were often considered unwomanly and indelicate because of their race. Stewart challenged this notion by referring to them as the fair daughters of Africa, and she advocated for a broader conception of their social and economic roles by suggesting that Black women's fairness was at odds with their labor. Stewart emphasized Black women's femininity in order to advance abolition. In her writings and speeches, Stewart occasionally directed her commentary towards Black women because she was cognizant that they were uniquely positioned within the U.S. socio-political landscape. The aforementioned pamphlet posited, "Do you ask the disposition I would have you possess? Possess the spirit of independence. The Americans do, and why should not you? Possess the spirit of men, bold and enterprising, fearless and undaunted. Sue for your rights and privileges. Know the reason that you cannot attain them. Weary them with your importunities. You can but die if you make the attempt, and we shall certainly die if you do not." Stewart did not hold political office, nor could she exercise the right to vote. Nevertheless, she put forth a vision of American democracy that could truly guarantee liberty and justice for all. Next slide, please. I'd like to circle back to our question for this section. How did Black women give meaning to American democracy in the wake of the American Revolution? Can we go to the next slide? Thank you. They accomplished this task in three important ways. First, they identified its limitations. As we see with Mumbet, she saw the inherent contradiction between Americans claiming to value and protect freedom while enslaving African Americans. Second, they sought avenues to participate in democracy despite their exclusion from the body politic. Maria Stewart shows how Black women capitalized on alternative forms of mobilization in the face of opposition to ensure that their voices were heard. Third, Black women like Mumbet and Maria Stewart demanded that American democracy live up to its radical potential. They embraced the country's promises of freedom, understood what American democracy can offer if only we let it, and have continually held the country's feet to the fire to ensure that it becomes the best that it can be. The legacies of Mumbet and Maria Stewart have lived on in the examples of other Black women pictured here, such as Black suffragists who marched despite facing racism from white women activists, Fannie Lou Hamer, who represented the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party and insisted on speaking at the 1964 DNC convention, Shirley Chisholm, the first Black congresswoman and first woman to run for president, Stacey Abrams, who did not step away from politics after losing the Georgia governor's race in 2018, but instead has led nationwide campaigns against voter suppression, and Kamala Harris, the current Democratic vice presidential candidate. If we accept the premise that critique is the highest form of patriotism, then Black women are necessarily the fiercest patriots this nation has ever known. For the sake of time, I'm not going to take questions just yet. We're going to move on to the next section, and then we can spend a little bit of time wrapping up at the end. Against the backdrop of Black people's and Black women's exclusion from full participation in this country's democracy, Black people have also faced profound violence. This begs the question, what does it mean to be a citizen in a country where there's a constant threat of violence? In order to help us think about the meaning of citizenship for Black people in the United States, I'd like to share an example or two of how white supremacist violence has persisted in this country from the 19th century to the present. Violence was essential to creating a culture of intimidation and terror that protected the institution of slavery. In addition to the forms of violence I mentioned previously, including brutal punishments delineated in slave codes and sexual violence, enslaved Black people experienced daily surveillance and violence on plantations. The famed abolitionist Frederick Douglass described the brutality that infused his slaveholders and his overseers' actions to such a degree that it was a marked part of his childhood. Next slide, please. He explains, the overseer's name was Plummer. Mr. Plummer was a miserable drunkard, a profane swearer, and a savage monster. He always went armed with a cowskin and a heavy cudgel. I have known him to cut and slash the woman's head so horribly that even master would be enraged at his cruelty and would threaten to whip him if he did not mind himself. Master, however, was not a humane slaveholder. It required extraordinary barbarity on the part of an overseer to affect him. He was a cruel man, hardened by a long life of slaveholding. He would at times seem to take great pleasure in whipping a slave. I have often been awakened at the dawn of day by the most heart-rending shrieks of an aunt of mine, whom he used to tie up to a joist and whip upon her naked back till she was literally covered with blood. No words, no tears, no prayers from his gory victim seemed to move his iron heart from its bloody purpose. The louder she screamed, the harder he whipped, and where the blood ran fastest, there he whipped longest. He would whip her to make her scream and whip her to make her hush. And not until overcome by fatigue would he cease to swing the blood-clotted cowskin. I remember the first time I ever witnessed this horrible exhibition. I was quite a child, but I well remember it. I never shall forget it whilst I remember anything. It was the first of a long series of such outrages, of which I was doomed to be a witness and a participant. It struck me with awful force. It was the blood-stained gate, the entrance to the hell of slavery through which I was about to pass. It was a most terrible spectacle. I wish I could commit to paper the feelings with which I beheld it. As with other manifestations of racism that have emerged over the past 4 centuries, the types of violence that Black people faced after the abolition of slavery may have transformed, but they certainly did not disappear. Next slide, please. Following the Civil War, the United States entered a period known as Reconstruction, which lasted from 1865 to 1877. This era was when the North and South attempted to reconcile, and the country at large grappled with what to do with its newly freed Black population. 3 constitutional amendments were passed during Reconstruction, including the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery unless you've been convicted of a crime. That is an important caveat. The 14th Amendment, which guaranteed due process and equal protection under the law, and the 15th Amendment, which granted African Americans the right to citizenship, though I must say that this was predominantly confined to African American men, and we wouldn't see women, well, white women, gaining citizenship until the passage of the 19th Amendment, and we are celebrating that centennial this year. But because of racism, we don't see Black women and other women of color really enjoying full citizenship until 1965 with the passage of the Voting Rights Act. That being said, Black people continued to face racial violence, such as lynchings, which pretty significantly limited their ability to exercise the constitutional rights granted by the 14th and 15th Amendments. Following the abolition of slavery, lynchings became a widespread form of white supremacist violence from the late 19th to early 20th centuries. Lynchings were extrajudicial killings committed by vigilantes. You may have heard, for example, of the gruesome 1955 lynching of Emmett Till, which received national attention. Lynch mobs, as they were called, frequently targeted African Americans who were accused of crimes or other perceived wrongdoing. Lynchings did not simply consist of hanging a victim. Rather, they often entailed mutilating a person's body or genitals, shooting them, or setting them on fire. Lynch mobs were rarely charged with or convicted of crimes. Lynchings were public affairs. So public, in fact, that crowds and families with young children would gather to watch these violent murders. So public that it was not unusual for a photograph of a lynching victim hanging from a tree to be turned into a postcard. I'm not exaggerating. You could probably Google that right now if you wanted to, though I do not recommend it. Indeed, lynchings were a form of domestic terrorism designed to intimidate Black communities that transgressed racial boundaries. As famed anti-lynching activist and journalist Ida B. Wells established, African American men were frequently lynched after being falsely accused of raping a white woman or committing other crimes. The real reasons for their lynching, in fact, were often that they had become too economically successful or had violated some form of social norms, like not showing deference to white people or having consensual interracial relationships. At risk of muddling the established timeline for future webinars in this series, for our final example today, I'll discuss a lynching that took place in 1892. This was a lynching that Ida B. Wells repeatedly described throughout her career that can help us to see how racial violence transformed and continued after the Civil War. As I describe this event, I want you to think about whether any of this resonates with things we see in the present day. I also hope this example serves as a helpful precursor to the later episodes in this series. If there are any recent or current events that this reminds you of, please feel free to share them in the chat. After I share this example, Jaideep and I will transition into a bit more of a conversation to help connect the dots between all of the history presented here today and the contemporary moment. On February 20th, 1892, the New York Times recounted the lynching of Ed Coy, who was charged with raping a Mrs. Henry Jewell in Arkansas 1 week prior. At the time of the alleged attack, Mr. Jewell was conducting business in town while his wife was at home. Mrs. Jewell, who the newspaper described as a respectable farmer's wife with a 5-month-old child at the breast, was believed to have spoken with Coy under the false pretense that he wished to sell hogs to Mr. Jewell. Coy left, and shortly thereafter, Mrs. Jewell attempted to visit a neighbor. However, as the New York Times explained, the Negro, who had been hiding, sprang from his place of concealment and seized her by the throat. He dragged the fainting creature into the barn, where he kept her for about an hour. Finally, he took up the gun which he carried and disappeared into the woods. Search parties soon initiated a manhunt. Coy fled for 1 week until he was captured. After Mrs. Jewell identified Coy as her attacker, the leaders of the lynch mob, quote, decided on hanging as the mode and Broad Street as the place of death. Upon Coy's arrival at his place of execution, quote, someone threw a rope, end quote, but the crowd, quote, set up a shout of burn him. After, quote, one of the mob advanced with a can of coal oil, end quote, spectators implored Mrs. Jewell to come forward, take a torch, and light Coy on fire. Mrs. Jewell initially hesitated, but after some prompting, quote, the torch was applied instantly by the woman, who immediately turned and made her way through the crowd. The flames licked up around the Negro's legs, and he was soon enveloped, all the while yelling lustily. In 7 minutes, he was dead, after the most excruciating agony, end quote. Coy's lynching, to Wells, was emblematic of her central claim that lynch mobs cited false allegations of rape to justify racial violence. Wells repeatedly describes the details of Coy's lynching, and eventually cites Judge Albion W. Tourget at length as she highlights the undue violence inflicted upon Black men in the name of white women's honor. Tourget investigated Coy's lynching and released his findings on October 1st, 1892, in the Chicago Inter-Ocean. He determined that Mr. Jewell, quote, was a drunkard and a gambler, end quote, and that Coy and Mrs. Jewell were in an intimate relationship for over a year. Tourget also found that, quote, when Mrs. Jewell came to apply the match, Coy asked her if she would burn him after they had been sweethearting so long, end quote. We see from this example that although Black people were supposedly free after the abolition of slavery, and although Black people were constitutionally considered citizens with the passage of the 15th Amendment in 1870, the Civil War did not solve all of the country's racial problems. There were limits to Black people's freedom and limits to Black people's citizenship. Violence was a tool to enforce slavery, but after its abolition, violence became a tool to exert a different sort of control over Black people. This violence continues today, though it has adopted different forms. That being said, as we transition into more questions and conversations, I'd like us to think about how violence can prevent people from exercising their full rights as citizens, and how violence can be a tool to remind racial others that they do not belong and aren't considered true citizens by some of their neighbors. Feel free to share your answers in the chat to these questions, or to put it in a little bit of a shorter, more digestible format. What role does violence play today in racial oppression? In conclusion, in order to fully understand contemporary racism in the United States, we need to have a holistic interpretation of slavery that accounts for how it emerged on a transnational scale and how it was enforced through law and violence. We also need to have a firm grasp on the gender dimensions of slavery. Slavery would not have been possible without the creation of the other, an other that was both racialized and gendered. Following the abolition of slavery, Black people, and Black women in particular, sought to imbue their freedom with new meaning and push American democracy to its highest forms. Despite our best efforts, though, violence and other forms of oppression have limited Black people's ability to truly live freely as citizens of the United States. It is only once we begin to undo ongoing processes of othering that we can begin to grapple with the lasting legacies of slavery, violence, and inequality. Thank you.
Am I back? I guess I'm live. Okay, great. Nneka, thank you so much. That was an amazing job. You're covering such vast terrain. Thank you so much. You did a phenomenal job. Just want to emphasize to all the folks who are watching, first of all, thank you. Thank you for taking the time out of your weekend. Secondly, this is really, really just the tip of the iceberg. We're just starting out. There's going to be 6 sessions. And when we're done, we're still going to have basically just scratched the surface. So we really are just trying to introduce you to the history so that you'll be able to do research on your own, to become educated about the role of race in our history and in our present. Do we have any other questions? I think there's a couple good ones. Ranbir Singh says, how did Americans view slaveholders who had children with their slave women after rape? And the second one is, when did the Ku Klux Klan come about and what role? And I think that one is actually more appropriate for the next session, because we're going to be talking about that in the lead up to after Reconstruction. Would you mind addressing that first question? Would that be okay?
Sure, absolutely. So I would say that the question of how Americans view these slaveholders depends on which Americans we're talking about. Are we talking about white Americans, or are we talking about African Americans?
I assume white Americans.
Because I would say that if we're talking about white Americans, there have always been white people who were abolitionists. And so something to keep in mind is that the something we might hear today is, oh, we shouldn't criticize XYZ slaveholder or founding father because he was a man of his time, right? That's something that we hear a lot. He was a man of his time. Don't impose contemporary understandings of social issues on the past. But really, people in the past also said that it was wrong at that time. So I would say that it depends. I think that given the large numbers of people who were slaveholders who had children with enslaved women, to some people, it wasn't wrong at all. But also, there were abolitionists who criticized slavery specifically because of the types of violence that it inflicted on all people. And some of them were also attentive to how slavery ruined relationships between families. Many abolitionists were critical of the separation of mother and child. Many abolitionists were critical of the fact that slavery was more or less an attack on the family unit. So that being said, I would say that some of those abolitionists were naturally critical of sexual violence, especially when that sexual violence produced a child, especially when that sexual violence produced a child who was then enslaved. There were people who were critical to a certain degree, but also there were a lot of people who saw nothing wrong with it because they also participated in that behavior.
Excellent. Now, let me ask you a question too. There's this notion that since the vast majority of slaveholders were just a tiny, tiny percentage of the population, that the population itself was essentially not guilty of slavery. It was only the slaveholders. Could you talk about how all society benefited? In particular, I don't know if you've heard this particular quote, but Karl Marx said that if you were to end slavery, you'd have to wipe America off the map of nations. It's that essential to American building. So if you could address that, thank you.
Right, absolutely. So the argument could be made that, oh, it was only a couple people who were slaveholders. But there are 2 points. One is that it was millions of African Americans who were enslaved. So it may have been only a small number, quote unquote, small number of people who were slaveholders, but this had a massive direct impact on the Black population. The second point is that it also had a direct impact on the American economy. And so, especially after the invention of the cotton gin, which I want to say was in 1803, please don't quote me on that. Especially after the invention of the cotton gin, there is an explosion of Americans relying on slave labor. Because think about it, there are a lot of different crops that were being produced on plantations, if we're thinking about slavery in rural areas. So if you want tobacco, it's probably coming from a plantation with slavery or where there were enslaved people. If you want sugar, it's probably coming from the Caribbean where people were being enslaved, right? And so many of the goods that your average non-slave holding American would have used on a day-to-day basis to pull on some cotton pants in the morning, guess what? Slave labor. To go make some tea and put a little bit of sugar in it, guess what? Slave labor. And so it very well could be the case that only a few people were directly involved with the management of a plantation, but the alleged benefits of slavery were things that the entire country, quote unquote, benefited from. And I use this term benefits quite loosely. I use this term very, very loosely. So that is how I would respond to that question.
That's absolutely. And the other thing, I mean, there was a period, I think, for maybe 60 years where cotton was something like half of all imports. I mean, think about that. The cotton was only grown in one place and it was produced by slave labor. The entire nation was indebted. The roads that we built, the railroads, everything we had in the society came from the revenue that was produced by slave labor. And that's right. Something.
Exactly. And I would also add that I touched on this a little bit when I mentioned Mum Bet, who was in New York. But I want to reiterate as well that slavery was not only limited to the South. Slavery did not only result in the production of cotton. So in more urban areas, or in areas in the North, whether it's in some type of city or not, it was not uncommon for enslaved people to be hired out to then go work, let's say, at a blacksmith shop or something, or to go be a shoe cobbler, right? Or to be servants in a home. And so while we might be able to use the popularity of cotton, we also have to remember that slavery was infused everywhere. And so even in places where there may have been more industrial advancements, African Americans and slave labor were still essential to those. And so it was really widespread and not limited to any particular region. The effects of slave labor were far reaching throughout the country.
Yeah, I mean, I think from what I remember in Charleston, where you live right now, I mean, the harbor master was a slave at one point. Captains of ships were slaves. So, I mean, if you go to New Orleans, from what I remember reading, if you go to the French Quarter, almost all of the original ironwork in the French Quarter was done by slaves. So, I mean, they built this country quite literally. And that's something and that's been deleted from our consciousness. And I think that is central to white supremacy and the successes of white supremacy over the past few centuries.
Right, absolutely.
Are there any more questions? I don't want to let you go. I'm having such a great time. Well, I feel like we've taken more than enough of your time. We really appreciate it. If people have questions, would you be amenable to us having them email you?
Sure. And I think that I would also probably be more responsive on Twitter, simply because I'm starting a new job and it's the beginning of a semester. So I'm being bombarded with emails, but I can absolutely respond on Twitter. And I think that would also help other folks to be able to participate in the conversation as well. And so my Twitter handle, I will share it in the chat bar once I find it. I think that would probably be the easiest way to get quick any follow-up questions.
And we'll be sure to send that out to folks who reach out to us as well.
Perfect.
Wonderful. Thank you.
No problem.
Is there anything else you wanted to say before we let you go?
I just want to say thank you so much. Not simply to you and Kiran, but to everyone who has joined today and is tuned in, still listening. Thank you so much for allowing me to share in your community and to be able to talk to you and with you about some of the connections between what you might experience as Sikh Americans and what African Americans have experienced in this country. I really appreciate the opportunity to be able to spend some time with you all today.
Well, as of today, sister, you are invited to Lungar, which is our cookout. You are definitely part of the community. Okay?
Yay!
So, we look forward to seeing you soon.
All right, awesome. Thank you so much. Have a great weekend.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. And we hope to see you next Sunday night. Thank you for joining us. Bye-bye.